One more. Uno mas.
Saw some sparks gathering on the beach earlier.
Oh, found one.
Give it a good whack. That should lead the power straight into your battery.
Lighthouse done. Sparks. Fog is really close today.
There must be a reason. I'll take Anita and go investigate.
Got the ones by the fountain.
You didn't climb it, did you? That damages the stone finish.
Huh?
Ah,
Okay, found the ones by the memorial. Hey, Grandma, why don't we have a stone for Mom?
Just one more.
stones are for the dead.
But she's been gone for so...
I went with you today.
That's all for the beach, I think.
You're not going close to...
Lemura is a handsome ass lad. What the shit?
Nice.
Grandma! Grandma, can you hear me? I'm coming! Sparks, what are those? Grandma?
Sweet mackerel. I wonder what happened to Bane. Tread
Okay, I cut it really close to the shore this time. So we'll see if I end up spawning on the ground or not.
You came at the same
Dude,
time
same
as
coconut.
visitors.
Fucking same. No. Jesus, the speed. Okay, I did hit it. I was like, ah, did I not hit it? No. No, but I did. I'm fine. I'm okay. Okay, I did spawn on land. And that was when I was cutting it like real close to the shore. Okay, whatever.
I think I have what we need. Now what?
Well, get here.
I wonder if dying here then would be faster if I spawn on land. I am not sure. I'm just gonna do that. It did not gold. So maybe we don't want to do that. Either the death warp there was bad, or just spawning on land in general is bad. I don't know.
Gloom.
I told you to.
I heard you say your name.
If you say one more word while standing on that thing.
You know, sometimes I just wish that Granny would accept that things have changed. This is what we're stuck with, right? Some days it's not all that bad. Crowd to eat, ways to watch.
No.
And we might as well make the most of it. Not Granny, oh no. Everything worth doing was apparently done better back in the good old days. She just keeps rubbing it in, you know? When we had the dandelion, before the war, when your grandfather was still alive, blah, blah, blah. The war happened. Grandpa is dead. Sometimes she makes me feel like my future is already in the past.
By the mother of Sparks. It's really them.
What is that?
Surfing is so rough.
The dirty paws.
I feel like I'm gonna be losing a lot of time here just because my surfing's bad.
Seal of yours more later. Time to speed up.
Lemura is a handsome ass lad.
Sure,
What
okay.
the shit?
Nope, that was too soon. Oh my god, just let me do the thing. Nope. Triple jumps are so bad because it like resets all of your speed. Like you have no momentum, except like a few times. Okay, I just can't do this right now. Hold on. Nope. Bruh. Okay, stop. Just do the thing. Do this, do that, whatever. Ooh.
Maybe you're some kind of sea creature? When I was a kid, I always wanted a pet. I tried keeping an eel in a barrel once. Freaked Grandma right out of her socks. She was all like, eels are no pets, eels are meals!
Yep. Losing so much time. And then this, and then more talking.
Who's that huge stone guy?
That guy is Dr. Thelonious. I sure hope I've taught you well enough to know about him.
Oh, of course. He discovered Weave Rock.
And its uses, mind you. His work turned a small fishing village into a metropolis.
How sad that his life's work ended up like this.
No. Ooh, no. What's
Lamura is
this?
a handsome ass lad. What the shit?
Fry me for an oyster. It worked! Quick, let's get going.
I'll catch up to you. Oh, and I met the mayor's mother.
Cordelia? Well, she and her husband ran the Dandelion. Worked closely with them for years. The Regfield drills at work used to be a sight to behold, bringing up weave rock day and night. We heard their thumping all the way to the plaza, like a rhythmic lullaby.
How does it work? I mean, how did you get the sparks out of the weave rock?
It's a complicated process, dear. Simply put, the weave rock was fed into an untangler. Sparks and gloom were carefully separated, and then the sparks went right into the belly of the Dandelion, providing the whole city with energy.
What about the gloom?
Oh, we got rid of that. The gloom kept the sparks safe underground, but then it was superfluous. No use for the shell once you crack the egg. Of course, when those blasted pods, shrimps and lobsters, what is happening here?
Those towers are huge and kind of creepy.
Creepy? Ah, they're just machines, built to keep this city running.
They're just so intimidating.
They are, aren't they?
Grandma, it's the barge again.
Lamura is a handsome ass lad.
It's
What
this
the
one.
shit?
Of course. That behemoth of theirs, it's not...
It won't budge.
Oh, the drills must be set to manual overload. The relief valves are all the way up on the rigs. There's no way we'll get to them. This is what happens when you meddle with...
Sparks, I can't believe I'm doing this.
Ball. Up here. Here. Done.
Now you've anchored it. Just turn around and we'll get out of here.
If I can just stop the drills, it might leave. I know I can do it.
It's like, yeah, this one.
Pressure has stabilized. The
It's
emergency
this way.
should be functional again. It's going for the relief.
Lamura is a handsome ass lad. What the
That
shit?
monster enough. The question is, what happens when they're met?
It's not just the gloom. That spray, it controls those monsters as well. That's horrifying.
You had been around during the war. You would have known true horror. We won't let this stop us. Let's head back to Plaza. The tourist told me you were in need of some sparks.
Deep breaths, my darling. Waves are crashing. We are still far from shore. Know that I've got you. It's what my mom used to
Go,
say
go,
when
go.
I woke up with nightmares.
No, because I said fuck off, Molly. You fuck you too.
I'm about halfway between home and the plaza.
Oh, by the old central station then?
Where? All I see is
Yeah, go refund them.
Probably right under your feet. Too deep down for you to see.
was it like a station for sparks or something?
No, Shrimpy. For travelers. A busy place. Trains coming and leaving. People hurrying to get their tickets. And a bakery with lovely armchairs called the Blue Sky Cafe. Serve the best bagels in town.
What did bagels taste like?
Better than crab. I can tell you that much.
Ooh. Go. Dude.
Grandma, there's something wrong with the Let's see if that did the trick.
Well, yeah, sure, Molly, if you want to be unmodded.
One night when I was a kid, Grandma had a drink and let me stay up late. Then she started telling me about when Strandville sank. It was just 2 days after Grandpa's death. Granny was upset and wanted to join the fight, but there was no one else to watch over Mom. So they took cover in Grandpa's greenhouse.
That was so stupid.
Through his hundreds and hundreds of notes
But
and
cute, though.
drawings when something just cracked. Granny said that it sounded like the earth broke in two. They must have been so scared.
You let me put your finger. You let me. Molly. Yeah.
The triplets aren't too far. You should be able to spot them once you've passed the old cidery.
What's a cidery?
Your mother actually worked there for a couple of summers before she
Finally free from your control.
went
Need a
apple
kiss goodbye.
made the best cider around here. The sweetness that set your mouth a tingling.
Apples. I can make out the triplets ahead. Didn't you and Grandpa used to live there?
We did.
Is that where you met?
No, but it's
Don't
where we
need
had
a
our
kiss
first date.
goodbye.
He was so nervous.
Yeah, good luck.
I asked him out, dear girl. Without me, we wouldn't
Just
be
persuade
together.
Soup to be our mod, I guess.
Grandma?
What? That's how
Lamura is a handsome ass lad. What the shit?
Because you can't stop being more. Hypnotize me, did it so easy. Don't need a kiss goodbye, I'm on my own tonight.
Better not tell Grandma
La
about
la 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 la.
she forced me to turn her
Yeah, like 6 months already. I will hydrate soon, by the way, Coconut. Like now. Is the game echoing? Can you guys still hear the game? Behind the music? It's pretty quiet, but yeah, okay, good. Bro. Yeah, I just realized it was picking up on 2 different audio channels, so it would have been echoing, I think. Whoops.
Lamura is a handsome ass lad. What the shit?
Yeah, I don't know where the fuck I'm supposed to go, but you know. Didn't get my jump. It's over this way. Waves are not with me right now.
Lamura is a handsome ass lad. What the shit?
Time save. Let's go.
Young, before the war and everything, what were your favorite things to do?
Well, what does it matter?
I'm curious, that's all.
Well, if you must know, let's see. Strolled in parks, dined at restaurants,
Oh my god.
parties, visited museums, stayed late at the office, went fishing.
You went fishing for fun?
Oh, it was all.
I have to be in front of it. Pregnant woman has been helped.
Lemura is a handsome ass lad. What the shit?
Let's go. More time save. Go, go, go.
Sounds so crunchy. I still had them when Mom was my age. I'm sure she used to climb to the top of the tree to find the best ones. Not that I wouldn't know about stuff like that. She might not have even been a nice person. Maybe that's why Grandma won't talk about her.
No.
I do remember how safe I felt when she held me, though.
Dude, I hate it because if I hold shift or the boost key for too long when going into the air, I don't get the ability to dive again, which is stupid. Yeah, like there. Come on, waves, give me something instead of these like tiny ones that you're giving me right now.
Lamura is a handsome ass lad. What the shit?
I can't believe we're going to Candle Hill.
Oh, nothing to fuss about, Shrimpy. They're just people like you and me. Maybe a bit more crude. More mauls and hammers than knives and forks. Oh, the foreman of the Dandelion was the best mechanic I had ever met. He knew that plant like his own pocket. He would knock on the pipes with his wrench, put his ear to the metal and listen, and then say something. All done on your end?
Yeah, and I'm getting the bananas one again. I'm consistently getting it here.
What's that? Bananas? Why would I want bananas?
It means we shouldn't plan too far ahead.
Do you even know what a banana is?
Just something I heard Bane say once. Forget it.
What's the matter with you? Rambling about fruit.
Still so funny that I'm exactly covering where their avatars are, so it's just like, oh yeah, I'm the one talking.
Burn it
Of
now.
course.
You could see them from far off, like lit candle wicks. Shrimps and lobsters, this is a dead end. We need to find a way to break through. Did you talk to someone? What did you find out?
Apparently the generator that powers the torches is shut down.
Oh, well, that's an easy fix. I can even see it from here. Let's go.
No, I tried again. Wrong button.
One down.
No cause for celebration yet. Let's find another one.
No rest for the wicked. That's another one.
Let's keep moving.
Ooh. Bruh.
That's three. Come on, Ziggy, you can do this. Are there
Boom. There we go.
Try and get through quickly before we draw attention to ourselves. The hill crew don't... My. Seems like they're throwing us a welcome party.
Is that Clout's ship?
How did he get here before us? Oh, these folks are not easy to deal with. Last thing we need is Cloud annoying them even more.
Lamura is a handsome ass lad. What the shit?
Nice gold.
Try to keep them at bay. I'll guard the ship.
Click me on in the city. Close up, baby.
Here comes some more.
Guess that was the easy part.
Is it? Feeding off the chimneys? Let's set that. The ignition switches are at the top of the furnace.
That was good. Hopefully it spawns at that tower now. I can hear that after I've killed the enemies. There was like a sound cue. Like you can hear it screaming from where it's about to spawn at. Don't think there's anything I can do here to prepare, right? No.
Be careful, everyone. Here comes more of them. Time for another round of barbecue.
That was really good.
Feeling royal.
I was basically at both platforms before I was able to hit the button, which is good. So I'm in good pace here. Also perfect RNG for the fight, so... Duke.
Just one more climb.
How's it going, gamer?
That was some action. Since at least one of you. That's it.
Lemura is a handsome
Yeah,
ass
that was
lad.
really
What
good.
the shit?
That's why you want to set the middle tower to be the last one you spawn, because then you spawn up at the platform you need to be for the dialogue after to progress. So that was really good. Whoa, whoa, whoa. How's it going, Dukerino? Hell yeah. Yeah, and if you do that, Molly, I'm gonna have to report you for fraud. I'm sorry, but it is what it is. Jesus Christ, I'm gonna turn off that fucking command.
Thank you, Peppy. And thanks for sharing your story.
Ok, Duke. Du har lyst til at de skal snakke norsk til deg? Nå kan jeg faktisk være sint på Molly uten at hun vet hva jeg sier, da. Så det er jo enda bedre. Sånn uansett.
Lemura is a handsome ass lad. What the shit?
That's so cool. Can I try? She's not so fun.
Sure. Jeg skal aggressivt hviske på norsk bare for å irritere fuckings Molly.
Anything good around here. They don't. No one from the outside ever gave a dab about the Hill Crew. Only came around when they needed us. You mean, like us? Yeah, I guess. But who gave
Ja, du skulle fortsette med det kurset, Molly.
After the war, people who used to make us work for peanuts at the Dandelions just came pouring in. But this time, they didn't even have peanuts to offer. We turned them down. Decided to for ourselves. It made them real mad. Wait, this must have been way before you.
Det var overraskende, Molly.
Like all the hill folks.
Hva er det du føler, Kvuth? Okay, I'm gonna stop. What other languages do you speak? Just Norwegian.
What's with all the rocks over there?
That, my friend, is the Needle Prick Memorial.
Norwegian is, you know, my native language. Because I'm Norwegian, I understand Swedish and Danish.
Maybe one person, maybe 100. One day it was just there.
So it's like a 1-for-3 deal.
Till this area got too gloomed up to be safe. It's mostly stones and scrap parts from the area.
This place gives me the
I do. When I went to school, I did take French. But nothing stuck because my teacher was French and was really bad at teaching. The one time I learned the most, I had a fucking substitute teacher, and I really wish we had her. Like, usually she was the teacher too, but that one year, I don't remember why, but because of some reason, she just wasn't the teacher. So hadn't it been for that, I would have known French too. Would have been nice. I've tried learning Spanish before, which would be nice, because my grandma has a vacation house in Gran Canaria.
What Trevold said about the dirty paws, about the whistlers.
I understand some Japanese words here and there, but that's, you know, just because I've watched anime for so long. Also, Molly, what you thought sounded hot was me, cursing you out. Just so you know. Curse you at any time then. For you, Duke, anytime.
Lamura is a handsome ass lad. What the shit?
Ooh, Kvothe, nice. There are, since Norway is a North Germanic language as well, there are like some like similarities here and there. So like, I can't have a conversation with someone in German, you know, but like, I can understand a lot, or well, a lot of specific words. Yeah, right. Yeah, you should, Molly. Yeah, both. Hello. But yeah, just so you know, tries marrying me to get citizenship. Just an FYI to everyone. So I'm taken.
Lamura is a handsome ass lad. What the shit?
It's not a problem. To get citizenship through marriage, though, you still have to live here for 5 years. And be married for at least 2 during those 5 years.
Well, I got caught up in the fog, and then the polished ship came flying, and I thought I was gonna die, but Granny, they saved me. They sprayed something, and then there were flowers everywhere, and Rufus said that...
That bum at Needlebrick?
Anyways.
Time for this. Just hurry up and come home.
Promise you won't
Bye-bye, Molly.
there.
Have fun, Molly. I miss you, Molly.
Granny?
Let's go. No, stop that. Why are the waves always so calm here at the Night Orchard? Please.
Lemura is a handsome ass lad. What the shit?
Sigrid, where are you at?
Sigrid, it's Cassius. Answer us. We're getting ready to fight.
Fire at the barge, and you fire at me.
Tell me you're joking. Have you lost your wits? You crazy, stubborn, disobedient... Nobody does anything until I give the order. Is that clear? Stay where you are, Sigrid. I'm coming to get you. Sigrid! Sigrid! I'm on my way! Where are you? What's your location?
I'm right by this island. The barge is just above it, and it's... Grandma, there are flowers here. I think I see apples.
No. No, that's not possible. Are you sure?
It's just like the stories you told me. I never thought
Sigrid, my dear, you are brave. I give you that. But we simply cannot conform our actions to a child's foolish whims.
Lamura is a handsome ass
There we go.
lad. What the shit?
Big golds, yeah. Because now I actually did the skip, right?
What's happening, Sigrid? Are you inside?
Not yet, but I'm working on it.
Think I found another way in. I'm coming after you.
Lamura is a handsome ass lad. What the shit?
Nice. Let's see how bad my fight can be. Nice.
Glad you're not overly phobic. You again?
Nice.
Sigrid, you placed the seed, right? They're getting ready to fire soon.
Too busy to talk, Grandma.
Just try to hurry. I'm almost there.
Nice. So 102.24. Let's go. Nice. Good second run. Woo. RTA, that's a 102.37. World record. Well, if I upload this, yes, for now. But I know that they have a better one. I know that Glint has a better one. I'm just not sure if he's uploaded it or not.